Today we're at intermission. I'm going to kind of ask you to kind of present to me any questions that have arisen in your mind or things you think we should be talking about that we haven't talked about so far. And I will either try to deal with those at that point or include them in my presentation next week when we're summing up. Because next week is kind of weighing all the evidence and trying to come to something vaguely resembling a conclusion. And the other thing we're going to do next week is we're going to look to the future. What does the future hold for the Shroud of Turin? What are the scientists saying? What are the various people that have been exploring the Shroud? Some of them for most of their lives. What are they saying? What do they think ought to be done? There's an exposition this year in Turin of the Shroud. These only happen once in a while. I'm one of those people that don't want to get on airplanes. And besides, I have some of the largest images of the Shroud of Turin in my computer, and I can look at it under a lot of detail. But there's some things going on that if they just would let them out, might lead to some very interesting science. So today we're going to look at image formation and the role that skeptics have been playing in the Shroud. So with that, let's get going. So far we've looked at the Shroud from three perspectives. We've got three classes. The first one was mainly introduction, but we did look at the fact that the Shroud corroborates, in terms of the image, the various events described in the Gospel Passion accounts. And it not only does it validate them, but it gives you some additional insight. Things that you might not have thought about or known about the process of crucifixion, or the nature of the crowning of thorns, or, for example, the obscure fact that the aragonite in the dirt on Jesus' feet was unique to Jerusalem. A lot of things. Then we looked at the science, and that included the discovery that the Shroud image is not a painting. That is a definitive finding. There is simply no possibility that the Shroud is a painting. Why? Because there isn't any paint, there isn't any remnants. Then we looked at the history, because that's one of the more difficult things, because the Shroud only shows up in Europe in about 1355, and you have to say, oh, where was it before then if this is authentic? And we explored that question, and we concluded that there's at least a reasonably plausible account. It's got holes in it, but you can move forward from the tomb to the current time with only a few really distinct interruptions. So what are we going to do today? Well, there are these people called skeptics. Now, I personally believe skepticism is a good thing, because there are lots of people that would like to sell you whatever they can sell you. I mean, I get internet ads every day for miracle cures for things I didn't know I had, and stuff like that. And not to mention the innumerable pleas for money that come in the mail. I kind of wonder sometimes if we can't somehow have that filtered out at the post office. And the telephone, of course. So it's not surprising that we have skeptics. It is interesting that an awful lot of the skeptics are, in fact, relatively extreme atheists. So you they've got an agenda in their skepticism. And that's, I think, something you have to try to avoid if you're going to be objective, and if you're going to be scientific, which I try very hard to be since my credentials are all in science. You have to be objective, but you also have to retain a certain existential skepticism. That is, what would have to be true in order for this not to be an authentic relic of Jesus Christ's tomb? Or, contrary, what would have to be true in order for this to have been made by a medieval forger? Okay, to keep those two questions in mind. There are a lot of, because they're very complex. So, the skeptic's point of view, aside from many of them being atheists, is it's just too good to be true. How can, in 1355, a shroud shows up and it's got a photograph of Jesus Christ on it? I mean, give me a break. So that's just too good to be true. So they figure it's got to be a forgery. Don't know how, but it's got to be a forgery. And they point to the carbon-14 dating as pretty much exoneration of their position. Not only does the carbon-14 date the shroud to the medieval period, but it dates it almost squarely on the point at which it emerges in European history. So they see, slam dunk, it's a forgery. But the problem is the C14 date is the only piece of bad information, scientific or otherwise. We don't have any account of a mysterious, great, outstanding, secret artist that practices the obscure practice of making shrouds. We don't have one of those. We don't have an early pioneer in photography. So there's questions that have to be answered. Now, given the amount of scientific work and others that's been done, it's certainly reasonable on the part of the scientific crowd and the historical crowd, and for that matter, the religious crowd, to say, hey, you know, show me. You know, you've got one piece of data. I remember John Jackson made the remark, you know, when one piece of data invalidates a position, and every other piece of data you have sustains the position, there's something probably wrong with the one piece of data. And John Jackson is, you know, a pretty dedicated physicist. He doesn't give up lightly on things. So he's been trying to figure out what's wrong with the carbon-14 date for a long time. So we're going to say, show me how to make one. Okay. Show me what makes it inauthentic. What did the forger get wrong? Isn't that reasonable to expect that a forger in the 14th century would get things wrong? Understand that at the time the shroud appears in history, they hadn't discovered perspective yet. They certainly didn't know anything about photography. So we've got some issues with this forger. I call him super forger, because, you know, he has to be unbelievably brilliant in order to achieve what he appears to have achieved. How do I know how to make the distinction between the forger and the authentic relic in the tomb? And we're going to ask that question, especially with regard to the image today. The image is truly a mystery. We can figure out an awful lot of the things on the shroud, but no one has figured out the image. What's going on there? So what are some characteristics? Any demonstration that the shroud's a forgery requires that we identify at least some way that the forger could duplicate not one or two of the features, but all of them. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question. I've always understood that a forger is someone who's copying something that's real.
Well,
so,
I agree. There's no good term for it. You know, some people say forger, some faker. Would that be better? I mean, I don't really care what the guy, artificer. It's a little bit. A forgery is this thing purports to be a relic. The burial cloth of Jesus Christ from a first century tomb. So that's what's being created. So that would be a forgery. If it isn't, then it's pretending to be a burial cloth from a first century tomb. There's relatively no question that the man being depicted as Jesus Christ and that the artifact is intended to communicate the fact that it was wrapped over his body. Now, there's only one place, time we know of, and the body has all kinds of wounds on it. So it's reasonable to say that whoever made it, if it's simply a fake, had to be intending to make something that appeared to be Christ's burial cloth. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
That's the point. So the forger would have to duplicate all the features, and some of the features we've mentioned quite a bit in the science talk, but image characteristics, and we're gonna particularly look at these today. The blood flows, the fact that it represents forensic fidelity. Medical doctors who are practicing, forensic physicians, have looked at the image and have no trouble not only interpreting it, but telling you what kind of blows caused the wound, caused the bruises and the wounds and the swelling and the various things. And there are videos out there which, if you want to look into them, you can find videos of these doctors talking about the shroud. A couple of the doctors, oh gosh, what's the first one say? Buckland, Robert Buckland. Another one is Fred Zugaby. Those two, if you Google Robert Buckland or Fred Zugaby, the likelihood is that you'll get some information about those forensic physicians, for instance. The other one is Pierre Barbet. Pierre Barbet wrote a book called A Doctor at Calvary. He wrote it in the 1930s. And it's still an excellent reference to look at. So we've got all of these things that a forger would have to be able to do, and that's challenging. He also, by the way, this forger, that's why I call him super forger, he discovered pollen long before anybody understood pollen. And he seeded the shroud with obscure pollens, which he went to Jerusalem to get so he could put them on the shroud in appropriate places. He also went to a lot of effort to make serum rings that fluoresced around the blood stains just to prove that this was real blood. And the forger also had to get some dirt from Jerusalem by the Damascus gate, where there's some aragonite, which is unique in a signature form of calcium carbonate that is found rarely, but in Jerusalem for sure. And then, of course, he did an awful lot of research on the crucifixion so that he got it right. Okay, that's a tall order for a forger. So what are the image properties? Well, one of the ones we really haven't talked about too much that is really striking and is the one that put the shroud back on the map. Well, the shroud wasn't even on the map really in 1898 when Secunda Pia took a picture and discovered that the image had negative properties. All of a sudden, the image went from looking weird because it behaved like a negative. The image itself was like a negative. That's this image here. Doesn't look terribly natural. And yet, when you come over and when you take a negative of it, all of a sudden it's a detailed and rather impressive image. I know my own personal emotional response the first time I saw a picture of the shroud was that it looked like a king lying in state. I mean, it just had that, you've seen these images of King Arthur or King, and that's what I thought. I was a kid about 18, I guess, at the time, and I was just very impressed by the image. So let's go on. The negative image is a testimony in its own right. And we do an injustice to the shroud if we don't point out how dramatic, unusual, and unexpected it was that this cloth would in fact turn out to be a negative and have this positive image on it. Because that's amazing. It's simply amazing. This is a cloth we know existed for sure from at least 1355, and it has a wonderfully detailed negative image on it. long before anybody conceived of photography. So that's pretty amazing. So I think that alone is a testimony to authenticity. And if you go back to the early books written on the Shroud before all the science was done, they will almost all comment on this, how incredible it was that you had this negative image. There are also what I call the star properties. Now these are the things that a forger would have to duplicate. What are the star properties? Well, there's 4 critical ones. I call them the star properties because I was clever enough to come up with the acronym, and because I think these 4 properties are among the hardest to duplicate. The hardest property to duplicate, quite frankly, is the first one. And we'll look at that a little bit more. But it's also 3-dimensional. 3-dimensional? How does that happen? And the image is an aerial density image. We'll look at that. We'll also look at resolution, and I'll explain this term here. So let's start this journey. What about this superficiality? Well, the image is only on the uppermost fibers of the cloth, of the threads. Now you got to understand what a fiber is. A fiber is less than half the diameter of a human hair. The Shroud image exists only on the uppermost fiber, not fibers. I mean, if you push it to one, if you take a dissecting needle and you push one of the image threads to one side, the thread below, the fiber below the fiber you've pushed aside is white. The image is one fiber deep. Well, that's sort of macro superficiality. But when they took sticky tape samples, they discovered that the Shroud's superficial in a micro superficial way. That is, a sticky tape occasionally pulls the image off the surface of the thread. What's that about? You can pull and you get this hollow thing like a shell. What is that? It's 200 to 600 nanometers thick. Nanometer. My wife was saying, what's a nanometer? And it didn't occur to me that there's probably a lot of people here that don't know what a nanometer is. So you know what a millimeter is, right? 1,000th of a meter. A nanometer is 1/1,000,000th of a millimeter. The image is 200 to 600 nanometers thick. Russ Briald, in a video he did, said that if you just took a razor blade and slid it along the surface of the Shroud, scraping the Shroud, the image would disappear. How do you do that? I mean, that's just amazing. Now, what's the chromophore? Chromophore is a fancy word. I never heard it before. I heard Alan Adler use it. Al Adler said, we don't know what we're seeking what the chromophore is. The chromophore. Well, we'll look at chromophore a little bit later, but the chromophore is the thing that colors the image. Now, nobody knows why only the surface of the image is colored, and there's 2 theories. One is that it's an impurity layer, and the second is that it's the primary cell wall. But the interesting thing is the image is everywhere uniform in color. It looks like it's darker in some places and lighter in others. That is an illusion. It's an illusion because sometimes the image has more fibers that are colored and in other places there are less fibers that are colored. Now, Alan Adler and John Heller, two of what I would say the most rigorous scientists on the Shroud, said that the image is oxidized linen. That's what it is. There's no additional anything on the Shroud. The image is a surface layer of linen that's been oxidized. Or at least cellulose that's been oxidized. Some kind of a hydrocarbon that's been oxidized. Okay, let's take a look at these. Doesn't penetrate the surface. I think I pretty much covered this. Here's an interesting picture. This is a picture of a single image fiber, and this slightly darker area here is the image layer. Notice that the image layer is a little thicker in some places than in others, and it's actually missing here. It's been eroded off. And when you look at image fibers and you track the image, you'll find places where it suddenly terminates. Why? Nobody knows. What about this three-dimensional property? The three-dimensional property indicates that the shroud encodes cloth-to-body distance. The three-dimensional image isn't quite in right proportion. And this was addressed in Ray Downing's video, which came out a year or two ago, called The Face of Christ, something like that. We'll look at his images. And John Jackson, he went to talk to John Jackson, and John Jackson kind of showed him why. The shroud was caused by some reaction between the body and the cloth, which was mitigated by the distance from the cloth to the body. It was darker where the body touched the cloth, and it was lighter as the cloth was separated from the body, and it disappeared at somewhere around 4 centimeters. 4 centimeters, a little more than an inch. 2.5 centimeters is an inch, 2.54. And so at 4 centimeters, somewhere between 4 and 5, is image extinction. You don't get any image if the cloth was further than an 1.5 inches from the body. Why? But you can take the image and you can and it encodes distance, and you can get these kinds of images. This is a VK8 analyzer image. This is a D. German's image from converting the experimental attenuation curve, and he created a diode function generator, and they put the video in, and they got this image, which is a little bit, I think this one here is a little bit more natural than this one here, but this is equivalent to this, but it was done differently. It was done with a microdensitometer scanning the image, and then having cadets at the Air Force Academy, volunteers. No cadet was harmed in the process of making this image. They volunteered, and they cut out laboriously all of these cardboard pieces, which were then assembled into an image. Well, we can explore, and I showed you this in the science session, but I'm impressed with this, so I'll see if we can make it go again. Well, I shot that in 2008 at the Columbus, Ohio conference when Petrus Soons gave the talk. It's a pretty amazing image, and you can find his website, Google Petrus Soons, and you'll find all kinds of stuff. He's also made images where you can get these little red-blue glasses and look at them and see the three-dimensional information on the shroud. Done quite a job on that. But then we come to the real face of Jesus. Ray Downing's did a documentary. Some of you may have seen that documentary. Anybody see the documentary? For $20 you can buy a copy. So I think the History Channel, I don't know whether it's the History Channel that's selling it. I bought a copy, and that's where I stole some of these images. Once you have the video and you have a computer, you can go and clip out pictures. So I clipped out a few pictures to show you what. This is Ray Downing. He's an expert on computer graphics, And what Ray did, he had done a previous thing on the face of Lincoln, and he had actually animated Lincoln for three-dimensionally for, I think, the History Channel again. And in this one, he got together with John Jackson. They talked a lot about the image formation process, and Downing worked with Jackson to basically get the three-dimensional information out of the shroud, combine it. Now here, there's some artistic stuff obviously put here, because the shroud doesn't show any eyeballs, and the shroud doesn't really show a lot of detail about the beard. It does show where it is, and so Downing added the hair and the beard realistically, but everything else is pretty much information derived directly from the Shroud of Turin. Very interesting stuff. Well, what about aerial density? Well, I mentioned what aerial density is earlier. Here's a micro photograph of from Mark Evans from the 1978 conference, and you can see this is image in the darkest image area. Can you see much? Not too much. One of the problems with talking about the shroud sometimes is we're always looking at photo enhanced images, because the shroud image is very faint. This is image right here, these slightly yellowish darker fibers that are right next to, in some cases, lighter fibers. I was talking to John Jackson at the St. Louis conference, and he would really like, I think, to do this again, because he's concerned that some of these apparent bright areas are just specular reflection from the surface of the linen, and he can't be positive that these are that you can make analytical judgments from these kinds of threads. But you can see here's a particularly dark thread. Notice that it follows the general cast of the threads. I call that a striation. Because you have to account, if you have an image mechanism and it colors the fibers, how come it colors a fiber along the length of the fiber? The mechanism must, in some sense, know which way the fiber's going. You can't do that unless the mechanism is such that it favors staying with the fiber rather than going off the fiber to the adjacent fiber. So that makes me, trust me, nobody knows how the image got there, but there are these little clues that make you want to scream sometimes. There's got to be an answer to this question. This is the kind of image that the shroud is. It's an aerial density image. In these images, there are only two colors, black and white. But where there are more black, then it looks darker. Where there are less, it looks lighter. The same thing applies in the case of the shroud. Now here's a tough one. This is the last of the star elements, resolution. How do you get resolution on an image, on a cloth? Now, a painter would have no trouble, because a painter creates resolution by doing the painting. But if you're trying to paint on individual thread fibers on the surface of threads 200 to 600 nanometers thick, you have a problem. Now, John Jackson wanted to answer the question, how do you characterize the resolution? How good does the process have to be? And he wrote this in a 1977 paper that he did before the Shroud of Turin research project was allowed to go to Turin and see the shroud. So he did this based on the experiments that they did at the Air Force Academy, where they enveloped a human being with a shroud, and they made measurements of the distance that the cloth was from the surface of the human being. And Jackson said, how do I characterize the resolution, and he concluded that one way is, you say, he found one area that he thought he could characterize the resolution pretty well, which was the lips. He said you could resolve the lips on the shroud pretty well, and that was a resolution of something like 0.4 centimeters, about, you know, that much. Okay. How far away from the cloth were the lips? Well, you can kind of, that's not even terribly hard, you know, you can kind of take and put a ruler from your nose to your chin and figure out roughly how long. And he concluded that maybe about 1.1 centimeters. And so the way he characterized the resolution was to take the ratio of the distance between the lips, which was how well it was resolving, and how far away that particular point was on the cloth, and he got this D/D ratio of 1/3, and he basically said that in order to get a image like the shroud, you must achieve that degree of resolution with any process that you propose. You have to do at least 1/3 or better D/D. So where does that leave us? Well, we have the negative property, we have the star properties. How do you do all of that? How are these characteristics compatible with one another? Resolution requires collimation and focus. What do I mean by collimation? Well, you know, parallel lines up and down, the actual, and normally the way it's achieved with a lens is that you get a lens and you take the light that's coming in and it bends and it forms an image, an inverted image in this case, in a lens case of a lens. But we have a focused image on the shroud. How do we get that? How does that happen? It's just mysterious. What are the mechanisms that would allow for collimation? Well, here are a few possible collimation mechanisms. Gravity. If the image somehow had something to do with gravity, gravity is what's holding you to the floor. Gravity works up and down. So if whatever it is uses gravity, it would explain collimation. Laminar airflow. You've probably seen pictures of airflow over a wing of an aircraft. Laminar airflow is just smooth airflow. What about, how about this? The tube's been warming up all day. So it's nice and warm in the tube. The slab on which the body is laid is warm. The cloth is wrapped in the body, and the rock is rolled into place, and the tomb cools because the sun also goes down. Now you have a hot rock, which is warm, and an increasingly cold tomb, and the air, which way does heat go? Heat rises. I was taught that when I was a little kid. You know, heat rises. So you get a little draft that goes up. How about that? That might work. In fact, that's the mechanism that Vignon thought might support the vaporograph theory. How about the Earth's static electric field? Most of us don't think very much about the Earth's static electric field, but it's actually fairly high. And of course, when you walk around, you can get static electricity all the time, especially when it's really dry and not very humid. You rub your feet, you know, if you want to get your kids, you know, mad at you, you know, you rub your feet on the floor and you come over, come here, come here. And you get, you know, I have to admit I've done that a few times. It works better with boys than girls. Girls just really get mad, but boys just get even. They come back and they run around the house rubbing their feet on the floor and come back and zap you again. And the other thing you can do with static electricity is you rub balloons on your chest, everywhere on your sweater, and you can stick them all over that's great fun. I used to get balloons and blow them up just for the hell of it and rub them and stick them on the wall. So the Earth's static field is, and now the only problem is for the static field to work, you have to have charged particles. So where did the charged particles come from? Well, it turns out there are some around all the time, so that might work. Also, when we get later and we see some of the wilder image formation theories, you'll discover that some of the theories involve the generation of charged particles. So maybe the electric field has something to do with it. Some combination. One of the problems you run into in the universe is everybody wants to know the answer, right? Were you brought up? I mean, I was brought up, you know, and you get the impression in school that there's only one answer to everything. What's the answer? Well, real world isn't like that. The real world has lots of complicated situations where the answer is a combination of factors, and you have to know all the factors to know the answer. Or you can have multiple answers. And certainly something like the Shroud, which if it was generated by natural forces of some kind in combination, could be quite complex. There might be more than one factor involved. So some combination is pretty legitimate. And yet, we don't have a clue. We don't know. But collimation isn't even enough. Suppose you had collimation, you achieved collimation, you've got something collimated, and it hits the Shroud, and it would make a silhouette. It wouldn't make an image. You have to have, in addition to collimation, so that you get the resolution, the detail, you have to have something that's modifying the intensity of the image as a function of the distance between the cloth and the body. How does that work? The image mechanism includes the cloth-to-body distance. We know that. We've seen it. We have pictures of it. We can measure it. But how does that work? How does it happen? Somehow the agency that creates the image degrades with distance and it extinguishes after 4 to 5 centimeters. What's going on between the body and the cloth? Who knows? Remember that word chromophore. Chromophore is the part of a molecule responsible for its color. That was one of the things that was sort of mystifying to the Shroud scientists who were looking at the Shroud. And they finally concluded, and I'm not sure how to describe, I'm not a chemist. I'm not only not a chemist, but the only chemistry I ever took was inorganic, inorganic chemistry, not organic chemistry. This is organic chemistry. Inorganic chemistry is things like, mixing hydrochloric acid with zinc and getting hydrogen and zinc chloride or something like that. These guys are doing stuff with long chain polymer molecules of carbon and oxygen. According to Adler, who's a chemist, and John Heller, who I think is a biologist but a biochemist, they concluded that the chromophore of the Shroud is oxidized cellulose, and they could make the image color go away. Now that's critical. I mean, that's really interesting. They took image fibers and they put them in diamide. Now, I have no idea what diamide is, but from what I've read, it's nasty stuff. It's the stuff that said, don't do this in your kitchen. It'll burn you. I mean, it's bad stuff. You stick the image fiber in the diamide, and the color goes away. Because what the diamide is an extremely powerful reducing agent. All the usual reducing agents don't do anything to the image fiber, which indicates that the image is very robust. But diamide was the only thing they found that would bleach a fiber, reduce the fiber, take the oxygen out of it. Now, it has something to do with modifying the bonds. I'd have to go back to school to learn really how it works. But that's an important piece of information. You can get rid of the image color with a chemical process. but only a very extremely strong chemical process. A catalytic compound, stimulus, read stimulus for that, promoted the oxidation of the cellulose of the linen/impurity layer to produce a thin 200 to 600 nanometer image. That's called an interpretation, okay, or a conclusion. That's certainly what seems to be implied by the data we have, that there's some catalytic, something that promotes oxidation caused the cellulose of the linen to oxidize, but only in a thin layer. That's tough. And then we finally have to ask the question, well, what causes the extinction? So suppose we had a vapor coming up from the body, that why isn't the whole shroud, you know, why isn't it just a silhouette of yellow? We don't know. What's magic about the distance? Now, we're going to see some pretty wacky image theories, well, I shouldn't judge them that way, but we'll see some interesting theories a bit later in this talk. But some thoughts about the extinction distance, depending on the mechanism, we have a question about how long did it take the image to form. The time frame of the extinction distance, if the image was created by light, the speed of light, 5 centimeters, would be covered at the speed of light in 0.167 nanoseconds. A nanosecond is 1/1000th of a second. So, boy, would that be a fast image. Whack! And you've got an image. Well, okay. What about gravity? How long does it take something to fall 5 centimeters in gravity? About a second, 0.96 seconds. What about electric fields? Well, that varies with the strength of the field and the charge of the body that's being moved by the field. You can make things go up or down in the field depending on whether they're positively or negatively charged. And one of the things that's often forgotten in this whole question about images is that there's an image on the top of the body, but there's an image of the back of the body. So whatever the image mechanism is, it has to work just as well down as up. So we've just made it even harder. How does that work? Finally, you have a gas or aerosol in a draft. I mentioned the draft idea. So one possibility is that the process might involve a chemically active entity that's consumed as it goes through the intervening distance. What would that be? I don't know, but that's a possibility. Now, Jackson did something really kind of interesting. You can just barely make out the picture here. If you get the real face of Jesus, it's covered in, I stole this image as a frame grab from the real face of Jesus. I was looking, Jackson wrote a paper about this a long time ago, and there were some really cool images in the paper, but I couldn't find a copy online, and I couldn't find the copy I have I Xeroxed it about 15 years ago and stuck it in a folder, and I couldn't find the folder. I have 20, 30, 40 folders flying around the house with stuff in them. But he took a bust of a human face. If you've seen you might remember it. He coated the bust with phosphorescent paint. That's paint that'll glow if you illuminate it with ultraviolet light. You charge it up, and then it'll glow for a while. You've all seen glowing things. He then immersed it in a water with a dye so that the water was tinted. And the further you go through the water, the more tint you had to go through. And then he took a picture. Well, let's tabulate the things he just done. He made the image, he made the face of a man, a bust, glow. Well, that's energy that would be moving away from the bust. he put it in a medium that attenuated the energy, the light, more the further it went through the dyed water. So now we have a light image that varies in intensity with distance. Everything was darkened so that the only light was the bust, and the light was being modulated by the ink. Now we take a picture with a camera. Now that's cheating, right? In fact, the whole thing is a little bit of a cheat, but because he's trying to simulate the process that would produce a three-dimensional image. Why is it cheating? It's got lenses in it, it focuses, it creates, but we know, we're pretty confident there weren't any lenses in the tomb making the image on the shroud. But give Jackson a break, he's just trying to simulate the process and demonstrate it's three-dimensional. And so he did that, and voila, he gets a three-dimensional image that if you put it in a VP8 image analyzer, it looks legitimate. There's only one problem. It is that if you actually put a cloth, if you put the bust in a plastic container that's curved, so it sort of simulates the cloth over the face, then what happens is you get a flattened image, which is, some people think, is a little bit more what the VP8 image analyzer image looks like. It's been flattened because there's a little bit of image distortion from the fact that the cloth was over the face. Well, how interesting is that? And don't forget, Adler demonstrated that the blood went on before the image. So just to give you an idea, I used the back. This is the transmitted light picture of the shroud. And here's the blood. You can't see the image. So what the artist or forger or whoever did this thing, if it wasn't actually the shroud of Christ, what he had to do is he had to put this blood on the cloth and then register the image later so that it corresponded forensically with the location of the blood. And that's kind of tricky, which is an understatement. I'm good at understatements, you know. It's more than kind of tricky, it's ridiculously tricky. So I don't think that's much probability that we have a forger, but you know, Super Forger has immense capabilities quite beyond the ordinary, so maybe we've got something. So what plays the role of the, yes?
Has there been any correlation between the transfiguration of Jesus, where he has this glow?
That's a good question. That's a really interesting question, because at the transfiguration, Jesus is said to have glowed. I mean, he became, I mean, almost, he blew the disciples away, basically, and these two figures showed up, Elisha and Elijah, or somebody showed up to talk to him, and he's glowing. There are people who have talked about it. Russ Briall tends to talk about it. Russ Briall is a kind of a friend of mine. He's a cool guy. He gives very religious talks about the shroud.
What's his name?
Russ Briall, B-R-E-A-U-L-T. I think you'll find links on your handout to Shroud University and shroudencounter.com. Russ makes a big deal about light, because he's bought into an image theory we haven't touched yet. We'll get to it. I am playing the role of scientist and skeptic, and from Missouri, the show me state. I want people to say, okay, yeah, if it's light from Jesus's body that did this, how did that work exactly? And by the way, last time I looked, scientists have almost nothing to say about miracles, because they don't have any basis on which to process miracle data. But we'll see some exceptions to that as we go forward here. So it's a tall order to get all these mechanisms together. Ray Downing's show made a really good presentation. One of the best presentations, by the way, of this whole image problem was given in his show, which I was quite impressed with. So here we are. We're faced with this conundrum. Was it produced in a studio somewhere in some magical way by a super forger, or is this the result of something that happened in a first century tomb? Was it an artist or a natural phenomenon? What options do we really have? Well, we obviously have the option that somehow Superforger did it. We don't know how he did it, but Superforger could be, and maybe it's her, you know, Superforger did it. But we do know an awful lot about the image at this point, and it certainly seems implausible. What about natural phenomena? Well, we'll have to talk about that. Nobody's been able to do it, so we don't know what the natural phenomena is. Now, what about supernatural phenomena? Well, the problem, I think, with there's no question that if you answer the question, is there a God, with yes, and is he a God that is willing to interfere in the natural world he created in order to accomplish his ends? And you answer that yes, and he can do essentially whatever he wants, yes, then could he do this? Yes. I mean, but how would you know? How would you know that it was a supernatural phenomenon and not a natural phenomenon, when you can't even figure out what it is? Pretty much. It's a tough, I think it's a tough problem. So I want to talk about some theories that people have suggested, and keep in mind that whatever is true has to explain all the details. It's not enough to explain one thing. You've got to get it all. Now, it might be helpful if you got some of it, because then maybe you could say, well, this phenomena explains this much, and some other phenomena explains the rest. Well, what are the phenomena? We mentioned earlier Vignon's vaporograph theory. Now, this is the first image theory that anybody had besides that some artist painted it. And Vignon, we mentioned that Vignon basically said that he thought it came from vapors coming up from the body, staining the cloth, rising in the still air of the tomb, okay? And he was able, using zinc powder on a bust, to produce, you know, a kind of a fuzzy image. And fuzziness is a big problem with the vaporograph theory, because there's a process called diffusion, and diffusion violates collimation, because it tends to make things fuzzy. The particles, as they go up, they also go sideways, and if they go sideways enough, then they can't image detail. So that's a problem. Now, we've seen Ray Rogers before, so I won't dwell on this slide much. Ray was a chemist working for Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's a Los Alamos Fellow. He's really an impressive guy. And he was determinedly, his approach was to find, there has to be a natural reason for the shroud. And he got off, he quit looking at the shroud when the carbon date came up bad, because he said, must be a fake. Don't know how, don't know why, but it's got a bad carbon date. Then he discovered the people who challenged the carbon date with a plausible thing that would work if it was true, and Ray Rogers said, I'll show them up in 5 minutes. And he went and looked at his threads, and he looked at the samples he had, and he said, they're right. They're right. Something is wrong with this sample area that's sufficient to invalidate the carbon-14 date. Not that the carbon-14 date is wrong. The carbon-14 date did what it does. It told you how much carbon-14 was there, and then they took a curve and some graphics and stuff, and they said, okay, this much carbon-14 means it's this old. The problem was that the cloth isn't representative of the shroud as a whole. We're not absolutely sure why, but there's all kinds of bad things. It had dye, it had a mixture of cotton fibers that probably shouldn't be there. It had too much vanillin compared to the amount that's in the shroud. We talked about that during the science talk. Now Ray, before he died, he was really working to try to come up with a way that the shroud image might have developed. And he concluded that something called a Maillard reaction was what he thought the most likely approach. And that's a Maillard reaction is a reaction. Have you ever made caramel? Cooked sugar turns brown? Okay, that's an example of a Maillard reaction. But it doesn't always happen. Basically it's a discoloration produced in starches and sugars caused by heat. It doesn't have to be real hot heat, just heat. And it also chemical reaction can produce it. So he theorized that the cloth of the shroud had been starched. That's not even a theory, that's just the way they made linen in those days. They would, in the early days, they would spin the yarns, the linen thread fibers, into threads. They would get a whole bunch of threads that had been spun, and then they would starch those, but they didn't have the kind of chemical starches we have today. They did it in plant liquids derived from plants, and they used, one of the liquids was a liquid called Saponaria officinalis, and Pliny, an ancient writer, talks about the ancient production of linen. Now what Ray came up with was kind of fascinating. When they starched the linen, when they bleached the linen rather with the saponarias, and then they dried it, what happens? The liquid, the whole process of drying causes the liquid to exit the fibers. Well, when it exits the fibers, does it take all the saponarius with it? No, it leaves a very thin layer of saponarius on the surface. And subsequent washing will take some of that off, but doesn't typically take it all off. So there's a very thin layer, an impurity layer, that's left behind. Now, in addition, when they weave linen, they strengthen or I'm not sure the motivation for doing it, but they put starch on the warp threads. Now, the warp threads are the threads that go this way, and the weft threads are the ones that go this way. But they starch the warp threads, rubbing a starch material on the threads. And that's also a material that, if it doesn't all wash off, would leave behind a little bit of a residue. And that tiny thin residue is what Ray Rogers thought was the basis for the Maillard reaction, which then advanced because of vapors coming off the body. Sounds like Vignon with a little bit of clarification. But what does it answer? Well, it answers it answers at least 3 questions. Well, maybe I'm not sure about the third, but it certainly answers the question about the layer. The thinness, a thin layer of impurities would account for the 200 to 600 nanometer shell of image. It would account for the image color. It would account for variations of the image color that occur on the shroud that are called banding, where the image doesn't take up as well in one area as another, because the yarn lots would have been starched differently or bleached differently, and so have different amounts of impurity layer. And finally, there is the question whether or not a rising vapor would tend to attenuate with distance in the column. And that's the one I'm not quite sure about. That would give you a mechanism for extinction, because somehow the image has to not register after 4 or 5 centimeters. So that was Ray's approach. So that's the Rogers theory. Now, what are the cons? Well, it explains superficiality, it explains banding, it explains the uniform color, and it explains ghosts. What doesn't it explain? It really doesn't explain the resolution, because you still have the problem with what about diffusion? And it doesn't explain the general uniformity of the image very well. I mean, if there's differences, why don't we see the image as more modeled than it is? And finally, what about the striation of the image fibers? How about the fact that the image tends to go along the fiber? What's that about? So we're not sure. There are a few good things and bad things. Can we make one? Well, that's one of the things the skeptics say. The typical skeptic says, oh, it's not too hard. I'll just make a shroud. I'll show you how easy it is. We'll just make one. So I want to show you some of the shrouds that the skeptics have made. Duplicating the shroud. Well, the C14 date was welcomed by the skeptics. It confirmed their point of view. I mean, you know, would you be happy if you were a skeptic and you got confirmation? They were jubilant. And of course, the newspapers were all covered with things, Shroud shown to be a fake and stuff like that. But you still have to explain what the shroud is, just because, I mean, you kind of have to explain super forger. Okay, shroud's a forgery. Make one. Show me. How do you do that? It's a pretty overwhelming challenge, but the skeptics came at it in a number of ways. They tried paintings, rubbings, powderings, photographs, and more, trying to figure it out. Let's go forward. We got to introduce some skeptics. I've got a ton of skeptics here. This doesn't even begin to cover the two most prominent are Walter McCrone and Joe Nickel, but there's lots of other ones. This guy, Colin Berry, is a terrible pest on Dan Porter's website. When Dan Porter does shroudstory.com, and Colin Berry has his own website where he's sort of a scientific shroud scoffer. I'm not being fair, because I think he's an honest guy trying to, and we'll see some stuff. This guy's I believe he's a chemist. He's a doctor of chemistry in Italy or someplace, and he's an atheist, I understand, from somewhere, and I don't remember where. These guys, have done some. Well, we'll go and take a look at what all these folks have been doing. The first one, Walter McCrone, is an interesting guy. He's dead now. As so many of these guys are. It'd be nice to have him around. I saw Walter in 1985 at a conference at Elizabethtown, Ohio, in which he presented some of his shroud skepticism. Walter is a prominent microscopist, and his group publishes a newsletter kind of bulletin where he published many of his own papers. So since he owned the company, they weren't exactly peer reviewed, but and he also wrote a book called The Judgment Day for the Shroud of Turin. When the Sturp people came back from Italy, they brought back the samples tape samples they'd taken, and Ray Rogers sent them to Walter McCrone to look at, because Walter was a prominent and a very illustrious microscopist. And here's what Walter ended up saying, and I can't do justice to any of these people in the time we have available, so I just kind of hit the highlights. Walter said he identified the substance of the body in blood images as paint pigment red ochre. The blood image areas consisted of another pigment, vermilion. Later on he said cinnabar. I don't know if vermilion and cinnabar are related. I'm not a chemist. And that this is what was making the shroud, that the paint on the shroud was a very dilute 0.01% gelatin solution in a 0.01% paint in a 0.01% gelatin solution. And the method of painting was a method known as Grisal. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And it's a very faint monochromatic image. But it was a common technique, this technique, in the 14th century. Well, I tried to look up some of those things. The only thing about this I found was that it was a technique for drawing monochromatic, for making monochromatic images. Now, the bottom line is data trumps looking. Everything that Macron concluded was from looking at the sticky tapes through a microscope. And what he found, in fact, the objective data on which what he found was based, is he saw some specks of what he thought was red ochre, and he saw a few specks, one or two, of microgram quantities of artist paint. Now, it's a pretty large leap to see a couple of specks of red ochre and a couple of specks of artist paint to say that a cloth 14 feet long and 3 feet, almost 4 feet wide, is painted. And in fact, that's a problem. I mean, because his data totally contradicts scientific data produced by the rest of the team. And they finally refused to publish anything that Walter originally was sort of invited to be on the STIRP team, on the post-Italy STIRP team, the people who were analyzing things. And they sent him the samples. They had a little bit of a hard time getting the samples back from him because everybody didn't fall over and say, Walter, you're so wonderful, you've established that the Shrouds of Fate. And because they didn't do that, I think, Walter wasn't happy with them. But Al Adler and John Heller, for example, produced around 15 different independent tests on the materials on the Shroud and determined clinically through these experiments that it was blood. Walter Macron looked through a microscope and said it was iron oxide. Now, there was some iron oxide, but according to Adler, the only iron oxide was found either in water stain margins or in blood-stained scorch areas where the blood had been scorched by the 1532 fire, which caused the blood to be reduced to iron oxide. So he also pointed out that retted linen ends up producing iron inside the fibers. Retting is a process that's used to separate the parts of the linen plant to get to the materials that are actually used, the flax fibers that are used to make the threads. And that's also a process used to make khaki. And if you look at the color of khaki, that's caused by the process of retting. You get iron into actually the medulla of the iron enters and actually precipitates inside the linen fibers, which makes it, you can't wash it out because it's in there. The material in which the Shroud was made was retted. So there is iron and iron oxide throughout the Shroud, but it's extremely low level, so low a level that the X-ray data was unable to see any differences between the image areas and the non-image areas. It could only be detected in the blood areas because blood has iron in it. So basically, Walter's claims are not very sound. They're based on and that, by the way, Walter's claims about the Shroud were so outrageous that it caused a lot of people to go back and look at Walter's work on the Vinland map. Walter had declared the Vinland map to be a forgery based on looking at through the microscope. And I'm not sure where that stands now. It seems they had a good candidate for the forger, but that the claims that Walter made for the Vinland map being a forgery were not particularly sound. So I'm not sure about Walter. And I'm not going to go through dismissing everybody, but I got a little problem with Walter. Because I think he refused, as a scientist, I'm offended by another person who claims he's a scientist and won't listen to other people's findings and take them into account. And that's why Walter ended up sort of persona non grata with the Shroud of Turin research project. I mean, everybody was civil and everything, but basically they refused to publish anything of Walter's under the STIRP name. And that seems to me to be reasonable, because they operated under a peer-reviewed process, and Walter didn't want to be peer-reviewed. So now the rest of this guy's interesting. He's been working for a long time to produce a shroud, and he's got a fairly good shroud, probably one of the best. Now I personally am not too impressed, but it's pretty good. It's the only person. This is the only guy who has taken. There's only two people really that have made a full frontal impression. I don't know if Garla Shelley did a back impression or not. This is made by taking a cloth and a pigment that has acid in it and creating a rubbing over a real person. So he laid the cloth over a real person and took fingers, I think, and rubbed this material that has some acid in it. The reason the acid is important is the acid could potentially create the kind of color that you see in the fibers on the shroud. I'm very doubtful that this, I don't have a report on it, but I'm very doubtful that this particular technique is only one fiber thick. And in order for the rest of the paint has to come off to make it like the shroud. And then the image, while it's not too bad, is not too good either. And the blood was painted on after the image was put on the cloth. So that's Gare Shelley. Here's Joe Nickel. Joe's a stage musician and a professional skeptic. He's probably one of the most visible Shroud skeptics. Yes, ma'am.
Back to McCrum, where is his shroud now? The one he
Nickel mostly hasn't made.
Before McCrum.
Oh, where is it? You mean the previous guy, this guy?
Oh,
okay. Where is it?
Mm-hmm.
In Italy. So
it must be somewhere.
Well, I'm sure it is. I suspect it's in his laboratory.
Oh, okay. It's not on display.
He's a chemist, and but he's done. This is about the third one he did, and I think there's a video out that includes his work. It's one of the more recent videos on the Shroud. The Shroud videos go through cycles. There are kind of three kinds of Shroud videos. The kind that is sort of oily, religious. You know, in the sense that it, you know, there's all kinds of religious music and it's totally supports the authenticity of the Shroud. And then there's the kind that are sort of like the Shroud is clearly a fake, you must understand that, and they go through all kinds of things. And then there's the ones that are, the only ones that I consider to be really kind of meaningful are the ones that try to stick to the facts. What do we really know? And one of the more recent ones that's sort of skeptical in tone is the one that covers this guy's work, but it's still interesting to see the work. That's the only, I don't know whether it's on exhibit anywhere or where you could go see it, but he did make it, and not only that, he made some earlier ones which were really terrible. You know, so he made three earlier, I don't know if there were three, but there was at least two, I think, because I was watching a video interview of him. If you Google his name, I think you probably could find some YouTube interviews with him, because he got a lot of publicity when he first announced, because you know the headlines were Shroud shown, you know, Shroud. Now we understand how the Shroud was forged, or something like that, you know. So Now here's Joe Nickel. Joe finds himself debating with Barry Schwartz a lot, and then now he won't debate with Barry anymore because he never wins the debates, I guess. I don't know. He's basically his PhD's in English, so he's good, presumably a good writer. He's written a lot of books. I only show these two books, because they touch on Christian relics and on the Shroud. But he also has written books about paranormal phenomena, space aliens, and I mean, this is Joe looking through a microscope, pretending to be a scientist. The person I got this slide from was, I think it was on Dan Porter's site, and he made a snotty remark about Joe putting on a white lab coat as though he's a scientist. I don't know if Joe wears his white lab coat in his personal lab, but he's certainly entitled to. He's a nice enough guy. I only saw him ever once, and he and McCrone were both at the 1985 Elizabethtown conference. And McCrone didn't much care for Nickel because he didn't consider him a scientist. Nickel, on the other hand, actually cited a lot of McCrone's material in support of his position. Now, what Nickel liked to do was make rubbings over bas reliefs, and he would make full-length rubbings, but later on that takes too long. So later on, when he was doing his talk, he'd do a talk and he'd do a demonstration and say, here's how the Shroud was faked. There's a few things that are different. I'm just trying to show you. He'd say something like that. Then he'd put a piece of black velvet over a bas relief and rub chalk on it and come up with something like these. And he'd say, see how easy it is to make a Shroud. Well, I think so. Yeah, that was pretty easy. It doesn't look very much like the Shroud, but it was pretty easy. And so I have a little problem with Joe's evidence. His standard of evidence isn't high enough for me to be very impressed with Joe. Now, here's another and more interesting attempt. Emily Craig and Randall Bressy produced a facial image. They took McCrone's idea that it's red ochre. One of the problems with red ochre is it doesn't produce an image that's the color of the Shroud. So you really have a problem justifying red ochre anyway, because it makes a red image, and the Shroud image not only not red, it's not even nearly red. It's kind of yellow. So you would have to take the view that somehow the red ochre, if it was used, somehow made the Shroud oxidize and get the yellow color, and then you got rid of the red ochre. So that's a problem. But they did do a really nice job of, what they did is they daubed this with red ochre powder, basically the kind of jeweler's rouge kind of red iron oxide that, and then they pressed it against a cloth to transfer a powder image. So this image was pressed against another cloth to leave behind a fainter powder image. And then they took a negative, a picture of it, and they showed that they got a negative property. Pretty good. And not only that, I was looking for an example, but this one works pretty well in a VPA. And they were complimented on the fact that they were the first people really to get an image that worked pretty well in a VPA. On the other hand, the usual comments that are received is that there's no dust on the Shroud. This is a transportable medium, wouldn't produce a permanent image. Would tend not to produce a permanent image. The Shroud's been folded up, and there'd be red oxide all over the Shroud, and the image would have disappeared a long time ago unless there's another mechanism that caused the red oxide image to somehow transfer permanently to the Shroud. Because this isn't a permanent image, just little bits of powder all over the Shroud. So, give them a C-. I mean, they did a pretty good job. I give some of these other guys D's or F's. But now this is really a fascinating one. This popped up about 2005. a guy named N.D. Wilson. I don't know much about him. He seems to write children's books. But he thought, well, there's got to be some fairly easy way to make the shroud. So he did something kind of cool. And that is, he got a guy to do a painting, and then he laid the painting on he painted a piece of glass, just the face. A lot of these people only do the face because it's obviously too much work to do more. And he laid a big piece of cloth with this painting on a piece of linen, and he put it out in sunlight, bright sunlight, for a long period of time to get the linen to fade. And he got an image that looks pretty good. Here's the image, here's the negative of the image, here's a VP8 kind of a thing, here's the actual shroud. Not too bad, not too bad. There is a little problem. One is that in order to make an image this way in Christ's, in 1355, you need a big piece of glass that had to be flat and transmit light uniformly, and they didn't make glass that big in that time frame. And the other problem with this is the image is, it isn't the image that's faded, it's the off-image area that's faded in his method. And that's not the way the shroud is. It isn't, it's the face image that's the faded part, that's the part that's the oxidized. And that's not the case here. Here it's the stuff that's off here that's been, that's lighter because of fading. So, but he definitely gets a B. I mean, I think he's up to a B in faking shrouds. Now, Colin Berry kind of did an interesting thing. He took a crucifix, heated it up real good. This is the scorch theory. Now, the crucifix was only about this big, you know, it was one of these little guys. And he heated it up, and he laid a piece of cloth on it. This piece is kind of scorched, and different parts, I think, were exposed different lengths of time. So this part was exposed a little longer than this part. The problem with the scorch idea actually does some fairly cool things. I mean, it produces an image, it produces about the right color. Now, there's one problem with scorch, and that is the scorches fluoresce, and the shroud image does not fluoresce. So while the shroud image is the same color as the scorch, it isn't the same chemistry as a scorch. On the other hand, it looks pretty reasonable, so you can do some interesting things. The other problem is this certainly does not produce superficiality in the same ways. In fact, if you're not very careful, you burn the cloth quite. And trying to do this over a whole body without burning the cloth somewhere is pretty difficult, probably impossible. Now, one of my favorite assertions is that no problem, Leonardo da Vinci made it. That's pretty much the solution to kind of everything. There's a little problem with the Leonardo, but here is an image, half of an image of something called the Savior of the World, Salvator Mundi, and Clive Prince and Lynn Picknett think that Leonardo da Vinci made the shroud. They actually put a book out about this. There's a few minor problems, but it is pretty amazing just how close the Salvator Mundi image is, which is a recently discovered Leonardo da Vinci painting of Christ. It's really remarkable how close it is to the shroud. There's a little problem, however, and that's that Leonardo wasn't born for about a century after the shroud was being shown in Leary. And of course, if the shroud's older than Leary, he went back in a time machine to do this, you know, so that's a problem. Now, I think here's the actual image, and it shows some of the feet, the big eyes, the long nose. If you morph it between the shroud image and this painting, it's a pretty good job. So the most obvious explanation is that Leonardo was aware of the shroud and had seen it sometime or other, and maybe even was given access to it in order to make the image. We don't know, but he clearly didn't do it by getting a time machine and going back to over a century before he was born in order to make it. Another interesting one is Professor Nicholas Allen made a photograph using ancient technology that would potentially have been available to someone in the time. And this is pretty impressive, not because it's a very good image, but because he made a photograph using really fairly crude technology. He had this is actually I believe a bust, because the problem with this technology is you have to coat the linen with a material that would be photosensitive, and then you have to expose it for like a couple of days. It's kind of like a pinhole. Have you ever done pinhole imaging? That's a fascinating thing. You can take a card, put a little pin in it, and in a darkened room, kind of put it up, and you can get an image. You can see a pinhole image. It's a little tricky to do it, but it's really cool and a great science experiment for any homeschoolers to demonstrate some simple optical things. He made an image. He only made an image of the front. He didn't do the back. So in order to do the whole shroud, you'd have to get a body or some kind of a statue. You'd have to expose it to sunlight for 2 or 3 days each time for the front and the back. And then it doesn't produce three-dimensional, it produces a photograph. It really is a photograph. Dan Porter is, I've mentioned him a couple of times. Shroudstory.com is his blog. It's a really fun blog because it contains all kinds of skeptics and people who are believers in the shroud, and they argue back and forth. So if you like being entertained, Dan's blog is pretty good. Colin, that's not right, where's Colin? Colin Berry. Colin Berry had written a bunch of stuff, and he often posts on, he's got a blog of his own, but he often posts on Dan's blog, and there's people going back and forth, and he was going on about theories of shroud fakery. So Dan decided to fake the shroud, and I was so inspired by Dan that I wouldn't fake the shroud myself. Basically, Dan used some kind of a program. If you blow this picture up, it's all fruits, lemons and things like that, and now I don't know exactly how Dan did it, but judging from these things, he took a shroud image, he put it in a photo, like Photoshop or something, that has probably some ability to turn things into, take some small image and transform the thing artistically. Photoshop, I have Photoshop elements, I don't have the full Photoshop. So I did mine by sticking it in Photoshop elements and going to the portion that says you can do it with chalk. Take the photograph and reproduce it as chalk. So this is sort of my Joe Nichols version of the shroud, starting with the shroud picture. So what do you say? The shroud, I don't think the skeptics have done a very good job of creating shrouds. That's really where I come down. I don't have a problem with skeptics. I have a problem with them making kind of shabby looking shrouds and then telling me this is how it was done. I mean, if you're going to do it, make something really cool and show me that you really can duplicate the features. Typically, they only duplicate at best a poor approximation of the image, the way the image looks. But as soon as you came up and looked at it, you'd see either pigment, or you'd see that the fibers are cemented together, or that the image goes well below a single fiber and covers all kinds of fibers, and in between you'd see powder and debris. And by the way, the image doesn't look very good. And most of them don't work with a VP8 image analyzer. So we have to get a better group of skeptics, because the group we have is just not doing a good enough job. at least they're not convincing me, and I'm a little bit skeptical myself. So, you know, you got to do better. Now, the Shroud has inspired artists all over the place, and so I just thought I'd pop a few of this up. The mysterious and moving character of the Shroud. Because remember, Vignon said that the Shroud probably inspired the Vignon, these early paintings in the 6th century, and the Vignon markings, all these markings. Well, the Shroud's still inspiring artists. They're doing all kinds of things. This one's interesting. It's a stamp. I got it when I was looking for artist images of the Shroud. This is Isabel Pixit. That's really not quite the right. It should be longer. I must have messed it up when this guy is in Montana, and he's making a sculpture. There's a whole bunch of these kinds of things. I couldn't resist this one. This is kind of amusing. Anybody ever heard of Second Life? Second Life is a website you can go to and become a three-dimensional fake person. And you can walk around a three-dimensional reality of your own creation or other people's creation. And they create things in Second Life. And the people that create things in Second Life sell stuff. You know, like if you need to furnish your Second Life house, you can buy furniture. Or, you know, and there's some guy who's gone to a lot of effort to make three-dimensional looking furniture, fancy furniture, old furniture, or anything. You can go, the nasty thing is there's porn. You know, you go into the adult section of, and it's all imaginary nonsense. But I know people that do really interesting. There's some people who get into Second Life and you buy property. You know, and then you build stuff, like they build cathedrals. There's some people who like to build Gothic cathedrals in Second Life, and you can walk around. Well, if you're in Second Life, one of the things you can buy from these outfits, you can buy a complete display of the Shroud of Turin in 3 versions, which you can put on the inside of your church in Second Life. It's weird stuff. So when I hit this, I thought, oh, this is too good not to put up. This is, I can't read it very well from here, but the bottom line is the Second Life thing will come in 3 versions. You can buy it, and I don't know. I don't really do Second Life. The problem is this one's in the right aspect ratio, and this one's squished a little. Okay, I'll have to figure that out. Okay, here's Ray Downing. Ray is, he did that special we saw earlier, and he is, he's actually selling faces of Jesus. If you go and Google his name, you'll undoubtedly find, and he's got various, this is a version that he calls something like a Veronica, you know, it's his idea of what the Veronica might have looked like, but all the images are inspired by the work he did on the Shroud for the documentary. Pretty interesting stuff. I stretched, let's see, no, I think this is the actual original coloring. The earlier pictures I showed, I stretched the contrast a little to brighten the image. Here's a sculpture of the Shroud created by Luigi Mattai. Don't want to say a whole lot about it. Here's the problem in short. Here's some of the image theories. And I've got a few things to hit, but most of them, the gold means that it's not applicable. That is to say that the gold is something that surface chemical reaction typically won't get you the resolution. That's the problem with the Vignon and the Rogers theories, is the diffusion typically doesn't get you the resolution. Coronal discharge, which we haven't mentioned, the reason is that tends to be a miracle theory. That won't get you the typically the 3-dimensional or the aerial density, at least in my opinion. Now, I think Giulio Fanti would probably disagree with me violently because he supports coronal discharge. An energy release at the resurrection, I gave it all not applicables, but not because God can do anything he wants. So if it's a supernatural result of the resurrection, then the bottom line is
Who knows? A scorch from heated bas relief. Well, we saw one of those. I kind of questioned the resolution and the superficiality, but it's pretty clear that it'll do three-dimensional and aerial density because they're rubbing with pigments or acids. As you can see, there's nothing that comes up all white.
That is all applicable.
So we don't have any methods that have been advanced that really
Catch the star, not to mention the negative property, which
we haven't even touched on in this analysis. So, and blood before image is really a tough one. I don't want to.
Now here, I want to spend a few minutes and then we'll wrap for the few minutes on the unscientific hypothesis.
Miracles. Miracles lie outside the realm of science.
Well, almost. A miracle can have side effects that prove that something happened. And you may be able to tell from the side effects something about the nature of what actually happened.
I don't remember who first put this cartoon together. It originally didn't have this face on it.
And somebody put the face into the cartoon and that made it a real Shroud look.
I think you should be more explicit here in step 2.
Then a miracle occurs.
Okay, so what kind of miracles are we talking about?
Well, here are some of the miracle
mechanisms people have advanced. That the body emits radiation
as a result of the resurrection. These are all driven by the resurrection. The body resurrects. In the course of the resurrection, there may be side effects.
One side effect might be that the body emits radiation, neutrons, protons, ultraviolet photons. We don't know, but if you
let me have protons, neutrons, and ultraviolet photons and do whatever I want with them, I can make an image that pretty much fits. So there's a little bit of an ad hoc dimension to this that makes it a little speculative, boy, is that an understatement, a very speculative. Now, John Jackson, who has been thinking about this for a long time, is totally frustrated and came up with his own resurrection theory,
which is the body dematerializes into a shell of energy and the cloth falls through the shell, leaving an image.
So he gets collimation from gravity. He gets the image produced by ultraviolet radiation, or radiation, at least very short-wave radiation, which would potentially leave an image that's only superficial. There's some people that just say it was a flash of the resurrection. Like that solves the problem. I mean, the flash of the resurrection is probably not adequate to, you need more. All of a sudden the flash of the resurrection has to be of such a nature as to leave a focused
image on the cloth. Maybe it's some sort of quantum mechanical event. Now these are all purely speculative hypotheses.
Some of them, however, can be simulated. And to my way of thinking, if you can simulate it, it's getting closer to being science. If I can simulate it, and an example of simulation was that three-dimensional ink thing that Jackson did to show you could get a three-dimensional image. And that was a simulation. It wasn't a simulation of how the shroud could have been produced, but it was a simulation that showed that there were physical phenomena you could use to get an image that has properties somewhat like the shroud. Now, I think there's two kinds of miracles.
The one kind of miracle is simply supernatural intervention where God says something like,
let there be light, and boom, pow, whack. Or as Dan Porter said in one of his video, snap, pack, crackle, and pop, and things happen because God can do whatever he wants. And that's pure miracle.
There's another kind of miracle, which is a miracle of the second kind. And the miracle of the second kind is you get a miraculous result. That is, you get a result that has religious significance, that's meaningful, but in fact it results from purely natural phenomena, but rare phenomena that are multiple and simultaneously come together to produce the result. Unexplainably. May not be supernatural because you can explain every element, But each element, say I take something that only happens one time, one chance in 1,000, and I take something different that happens one chance in 1,000, and I take something else that happens only one chance in 1,000, and those three things come together simultaneously to produce something amazing. I'm just looking at an event that has only one chance in 1 billion of happening. I think it's reasonable to say that's kind of like a miraculous event. The flash of the resurrection, I think, is something Kevin Moran would support. Just a Giulio Fanti and Kevin Moran. Moran favors something like a resurrection flash. Fanti supports coronal discharge. I've been looking for a picture of Fanti's coronal discharge. This is August Aceta, who did an actual radiation experiment. He imbibed a radioactive material, technetium-99, which is used in medical imaging, and he had his body image to show that, in fact, you could get something like three-dimensional data and from it. So maybe if the body emitted energy and it interacted with the cloth, you could get something. Here's Fanti again with the coronal discharge. He actually, there's a video out which shows a rather smeared out image that Fanti got with coronal discharge. It wasn't at all Shroud level, but it's moving in the right direction. The problem with coronal discharge is, where do you get the coronal from? You know, I mean, coronal discharge is like hundreds of thousands of volts are required. Relatively, you can get it, but how do you get it in a first century tomb? It's not a natural phenomenon, because it's not going to show up with that kind of, but he likes it, I think, because he thinks he can get a number of the Shroud characteristics from it. Not all, I don't think. Then there's Jackson's bodily material dematerialization theory, rather controversial theory. I don't think it really works. I'd like to see it simulated. This is an example of a theory that could be simulated in detail. I don't think it works, but that's just my opinion. Is there a way to go forward? Can we identify the man of the shroud? Well, I think we can, maybe, and we'll talk about that a little bit next time. There's all kinds of relics of Christ that are out there. You know, we haven't mentioned too much about the Sudarium of Oviedo. We mentioned it, I think, during the history thing. Now, the Sudarium of Oviedo is a powerful witness that the shroud existed at least in 614, because the last time that the Sudarium of Oviedo and the cloth of the Shroud of Turin could have been together is back in Jerusalem. And there's enough commonality to argue that the Sudarium of Oviedo and the Shroud of Turin touched the same body. Well, they haven't been even possibly in Jerusalem since 614. So that's a pretty powerful. What about all the other relics that are floating around that are supposed to be Passion relics? Is there some way that we could validate the shroud by looking at them or not, or invalidate them one way or the other? You know, everybody always says, well, you know, there must be enough particles of the true cross to fill a ship, or, you know, the various rundowns on relics, I think, are overdone. So we could maybe look into that. That would be interesting. Sturton published 28 peer-reviewed scientific papers on the Shroud of Turin. You can get most of them, but a lot of them still cost money. You have to go to the source, and but the data on what they are, what the title was, who the authors were, is available online at shroud.com.